I arrived in the Appalachians in mid-October. All I wanted was seclusion and silence, a place to finally finish a novel that had been stuck halfway for 3 months. The publisher kept calling every week, hinting at deadlines and contracts, but I couldn't force even a single line out of myself. The ad for a rental house came through some friend of a friend. 2 months, $300 a month, total isolation. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. It sounded perfect. No distractions, no bustle, just me and my work. The photo in the ad showed a quaint old house with wooden siding and a wide porch. I signed the agreement without asking too many questions. The trip took longer than I'd planned. After the pavement ended, I drove another 15 miles on broken gravel. The final stretch was especially bad. Potholes the size of car wheels and washed-out patches where spring floods had eaten half the road. Twice I nearly turned back and gave up, but stubbornness kept me going. By the time the house appeared, the sun was already sinking low, painting the sky dirty orange. The house looked older than in the photo, gray wood siding peeling in places, rusty tin roof, porch boards creaking underfoot. 2 steps were shaky, one plank flexed so much I thought I'd fall through. Inside smelled musty, of old timber, and something else I couldn't quite place. A sweet, unpleasant odor, as if a mouse had died under the floor and was slowly decomposing. The furniture was Spartan. There was a pot-belly stove in the living room corner, an old sofa with sagging cushions, a dining table with 3.5 legs, a kitchen with an ancient stove, and a sink where water dripped no matter how tightly you closed the faucet. In the bedroom stood an iron-framed bed with a mattress of questionable freshness, smelling of mothballs. I spread out my sleeping bag on top and figured it couldn't get much worse. The first 3 days went by surprisingly quietly. I quickly settled into a routine. Wake up at dawn when the first rays of sun broke through the curtains, stoke the stove with dry logs from the shed out back, brew coffee on the old soot-covered pot on the stove. The smell of coffee almost dispelled the house's mustiness, making mornings almost pleasant. I'd write until noon, sitting at the wobbly table, trying to ignore the floor creaks and constant dripping from the tap. After lunch, I went for a walk. A path started just outside the house and wound into the forest, weaving through old oaks and pines. The air there was cleaner, colder. I walked 1.5 miles or more, watching squirrels, listening to distant bird cries. In the evenings, I'd come back, make a simple dinner of canned food and pasta, and read by kerosene lamplight. The house had electricity, but it was unreliable, so I didn't risk it. I'd fall asleep early to the howling wind in the trees and the distant calls of owls hunting in the darkness. On the 4th morning, everything changed. I stepped onto the porch with my cup of coffee, intending to sit on the steps and breathe the morning air, and saw an object. It lay right in front of the door, perfectly centered on the worn welcome mat. A chicken bone, clean and white, as if it had lain in the sun for ages or had been specially treated. I picked it up, turned it in my fingers. The bone was light, porous, no traces of meat or tendon. Odd, but not enough to panic. Maybe an animal had dragged it here. Raccoons, foxes, even crows like to carry things around. I tossed the bone into the bushes at the edge of the porch and went back to my coffee. By noon, I'd forgotten all about it. The second object appeared 2 days later, a doll's head. It lay in the same spot, right in front of the door, as if someone had carefully placed it there, perfectly centered on the worn mat. Old, faded, with cracks in its plastic face. One eye missing, just a dark cavity, the other fixed in a glassy stare. Hair torn out in clumps, dirt or mold stains across the brow. I stared and for the first time felt real unease. This couldn't be random, or an animal's doing. Someone had deliberately put that head there overnight while I slept. I glanced nervously around. The forest stood silent, motionless. No prints on the ground, no sounds except the distant tapping of a woodpecker. I picked up the doll between 2 fingers, trying to touch it as little as possible, carried it away from the house, and tossed it into the bushes beside the bone. returned inside, locked the door, leaned against it. My heart hammered faster than usual. The whole day, I couldn't focus on work. Words wouldn't come. Every few minutes, I'd get up, walk to the window, peer into the woods, trying to figure out who could have done this. Kids, but the nearest house was a mile away, and as far as I could tell, there weren't any children in these parts. Maybe it was some local tradition, a way to scare newcomers. I didn't know. I knew nothing, and that was the scariest part. That evening, I decided to walk the area, wanted to know who my neighbors were, if any existed at all. I took the trail north, through thicker trees where sunlight barely broke through the canopy, and found another house. It sat off the trail about 50 meters back in the woods, a small, sagging building, as if the ground beneath it had sunk. The windows on the first floor were boarded up with blackened, weathered planks. The roof had caved on one side, exposing the darkness of the attic. The yard was choked with waist-high grass, weeds, and brush. No signs of life, a classic deserted place. I was about to leave, dismissing it as another dead home in a dead part of the state, when I noticed smoke, a thin wisp rising from the chimney, barely visible, but there. Someone lived inside. I froze, staring toward the second-floor windows. One wasn't boarded up. The glass was filthy, webbed with spiders, but you could just make something out.
And then, behind the glass, a shadow flickered, swift and almost imperceptible, but I saw it. Someone was there, someone watching me. I turned and walked away, quickly, trying not to run, not to show fear. But my heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. Got back to my house, went inside, locked the door, slid the bolt. All evening I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Each time I passed the window, I instinctively ducked, afraid to see someone's face staring back at me from the other side of the glass. The next morning, a third object appeared on the porch. A small glass jar, a typical preserves jar with a metal screw-on lid, the kind used for home canning. Inside was ash, and what looked like charred scraps of fabric. The lid was tightly sealed, but when I held the jar to the light, I could see the contents. Fine, almost powdery grayish-white ash, and faded, burned blue fabric. On the inside of the lid, something was scratched. Uneven letters, carved with a nail or a piece of metal. I brought the jar inside, set it on the table, and tried to decipher the inscription. 2 initials, an L and an M, or maybe N. The scratches were too rough to be sure. Now I could no longer ignore what was happening. This wasn't coincidence or a joke. Someone was coming to my house every other night, leaving these things on purpose, with a motive, some message, warning, or threat. I didn't know which, but I knew one thing. I needed to act. First, I drove to the nearest little town, 22 miles of the same battered road. The town was tiny, one main street, a couple of shops, a gas station, a diner with peeling signage, and a small sheriff's office with a single patrol car outside. I stopped at the grocery store for some supplies, though that wasn't the real reason for my trip. Behind the counter was an older woman with a tired face and gray hair tied in a tight bun. I decided to take a risk. I described the house I was renting, mentioned some landmarks. She nodded. She knew the place. I asked about the neighboring house, the abandoned-looking one with boarded-up windows, leaning to one side. She studied me for a long time, then nodded again. "That's old Dober," she said. "Been living there 20 years, maybe more. Hermit, keeps to himself. Odd, but harmless. Folks leave him alone. He leaves them alone." I carefully asked if she'd noticed anything unusual, any missing people, strange incidents, anything out of the ordinary in those woods. She frowned, the lines on her forehead deepening. "Tourists disappear sometimes," she said after a pause. "Get lost in the woods, fall off a cliff, slip into an old mine. The mountains are dangerous for those who don't know the land, but that's rare, once every few years." I thanked her, bought an extra pack of batteries, and left. At the diner, I grabbed a coffee and asked if I could use the internet. The owner, a heavy-set man with greasy stains on his apron, nodded and pointed to the corner where an ancient computer with a yellowed monitor stood. I spent over 3 hours there, searching everything I could about missing people in this county.
Old local newspaper stories, forum posts, desperate relatives' messages. I found several cases that caught my eye. Emma Clark, age 7, vanished 8 years ago, was staying with her grandmother for the summer, went out to play and never returned. The search lasted a week, but nothing was found. Linda Marshall, 23, tourist from Virginia, disappeared 9 years ago. The last time Linda Marshall was seen was at a gas station, buying water and asking directions to the nearest campground. She never made it there. David Thomas, 31, a drifter, disappeared 11 years ago. His backpack found on the roadside, but he himself never recovered. All cases within a 30-mile radius of where I was staying. All unresolved, all closed as accidents or voluntary disappearances.
I printed several articles, photographed the screen with my phone, saved the links, and returned to my car at dusk. The drive back seemed even longer. The darkness closed in quickly. I reached the house after the last traces of light were gone from the horizon. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the sofa by the window, wrapped in a blanket, peering into the darkness outside the glass. There was no moon, the sky thick with clouds, and the forest was just a single black blot. I listened to every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustling of fallen leaves, the distant cry of some night bird. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps, slow and careful, as if someone was trying to be quiet, but not quite managing. Someone was coming up the path to the house. I froze, heart pounding, pressed myself against the wall beside the window. The steps approached the porch, stopped. A long pause, in which I could hear only my own heartbeat. Then a faint sound, like something being set gently on the wooden boards. The footsteps retreated, slowly vanishing into the midnight silence. I waited another hour before cautiously looking out the window. On the porch, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight, lay the fourth object, a jawbone. I went outside, picked it up with shaking hands. Small, unmistakably human, with some teeth still remaining. Etched into the bone, in the same jagged letters, was a name. In the flashlight's glare, I read, Linda Marshall, the tourist who vanished 9 years ago. I was holding a part of her body. I vomited right there on the porch, barely managing to turn away. Then, still trembling, I returned inside, locked the door, barricaded it with an old dresser, and stuffed the jawbone into a plastic bag and hid it under the sink. I couldn't bear to look at it any longer. The rest of the night, I sat at the table, turned on every lamp in the house, opened my laptop, and began to record everything. Dates, object descriptions, everything I knew. I photographed each item I found, mapped out the locations where people had vanished, looking for patterns, something that could help me understand what was happening. By sunrise, I had a theory that chilled me. Dober wasn't just a strange hermit. He was a kidnapper, maybe a serial killer. He kept trophies of his victims and for some twisted reason decided to share them with me. A ritual, a warning, or a taunting game. Maybe he'd already chosen me as his next victim, and this was part of his process. I realized I was in real danger. If Dober really was involved in these disappearances, then I was the only one who could link him to the victims. I had seen the objects. I knew where he lived. He couldn't let me leave and tell someone. The next several days passed in feverish activity. I became an amateur detective, gathering everything I could. Every morning I checked the porch, photographing any new objects that appeared, and they always did. A tuft of hair tied with red thread, a child's tooth, tiny, milk white, a torn scrap of an old photo showing nothing but a child's hand and a blur of background. I took pictures of Dober's house from afar, hiding in the woods, recording everything. Smoke from the chimney, shadows in the windows, any movement. I'd drive into town and dig through archives in the local library, finding old newspapers yellowed with age. Even more cases of disappearances. Michael Adams, 28, vanished 13 years ago. Worked at the sawmill, didn't show up for a shift, and was never seen again. Sarah Johnson, 16,
Disappeared 17 years ago, ran away from home, at least that's what her parents thought. An unidentified man, around 40, whose body was found in the woods 21 years ago, partially burned, never identified. I started matching things up. The doll's head could have belonged to Emma Clark. One article quoted her mother, who mentioned the girl was never apart from her favorite doll, big, with blue eyes. The jar with ash and blue cloth could hold Linda Marshall's clothes. She was seen last wearing a blue jacket. The jawbone with a name said it all. Dober kept pieces of his victims, burned their bodies, kept only what he wanted, created a collection, and was now sharing it with me. But why? What did I do? Why me? I started noticing he was watching me. When I stepped outside during the day, I felt his gaze on the back of my neck. Whipped around fast, but always saw only trees, shadows, silence. The feeling never passed. One day after returning from a walk, I saw his figure among the trees, 50 meters off the trail, right behind an old pine. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. He stood perfectly still, staring my way. I couldn't see his face, just the silhouette, but knew it was him, Dober. I forced myself to keep walking calmly, not to show fear. When I reached the bend in the trail and looked back, he was gone. He knew I was starting to understand, or at least suspect. Some silent game had begun between us. I pretended not to notice, that the objects didn't frighten me, that everything was fine. I kept to my usual walks and routine, but at night I didn't sleep, sat by the window with a kitchen knife in hand, old but sharp. The objects kept coming, with terrifying regularity. Every 2 or 3 days, another scrap of plaid fabric, a rusty key, a tiny bone that might have been a finger. I photographed everything, bagged it all in a large plastic sack, and hid it under a floorboard in my bedroom. Evidence. I needed evidence. On the 12th day after all this began, I decided it was time. I had enough. Photos of objects, records, printed articles about missing people, a map of marked places. I packed it all in a folder, got in my car, and drove to town, straight to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was an older man with gray mustache and the skeptical look of someone who's seen too much to be surprised anymore. His desk plaque read, Sheriff Robert Kincaid. He listened silently as I explained, scrolling through the photos I spread on the desk, then shook his head. "That's old Dober," he said in the tone used for facts everyone knows. "He's strange, sure, but I've known him 30 years. Never had problems with him, not once." I showed him the photo of the jaw with a name, handed him the article on Linda Marshall, explained the links between objects and missing cases, how it all fits together. The sheriff studied the photos, his frown deepening. "These are serious accusations," he said finally. "Are you sure he's the one leaving these things? Do you have direct proof?" I told him about the night I'd heard footsteps, about someone coming up to the porch, described Dober's house, the smoke, the shadow in the window, about seeing him in the woods, about him watching me. The sheriff listened, drumming his fingers, then fell silent, eyes fixed on the photos. "All right," he said at last. "I'll go out, check, talk to him, but if you're wrong, you're going to have real problems." I nodded. I understood the risk, but doing nothing felt even worse. I returned to my house and waited. The worst waiting of my life. All day I paced, couldn't sit still, kept checking the windows every 5 minutes, strained to hear every sound. By evening, I saw the sheriff's patrol car rolling down the road toward Dober's house. I stepped onto my porch and watched from a distance. The car stopped before the sagging house. The sheriff got out, adjusted his gun belt, walked to the door, and knocked. A long pause with nothing happening. Then the door slowly opened. Dober stood in the doorway, tall, thin, long gray hair, tangled and dirty, dressed in dark clothes far too big for his skeletal frame. They spoke. The sheriff gestured, pointed at the house, explained something. Dober shook his head, then slowly stepped back, letting the sheriff inside. I gripped the porch rail so tight my knuckles turned white, unable to take my eyes off that house. The minutes dragged like hours. 20 minutes passed. Finally, the sheriff emerged. even at a distance, his face looked different. Pale, shaken. He almost ran to his patrol car, talking quickly into the radio, gesturing with his free hand. Within half an hour, 2 more cars arrived, then another. For the next few hours, I watched police work. Officers went in and out of the house, carrying out black bags, cardboard boxes, rolled up carpets. One young cop vomited right on the porch, doubled over against the railing, his shoulders shaking. Dober was led out in handcuffs. He didn't resist, just walked between 2 officers, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. When darkness fell, the sheriff came up the path to my house. His face looked gray, tired, aged by 10 years in a single day. He silently reached out his hand and shook mine. His grip was cold. "You were right," he said quietly. "We found things in there nobody should ever have to find. A lot of things, remains, clothes, personal items, photographs. He kept all of it for years, decades." I asked, though I already knew the answer, how many victims? The sheriff shook his head, rubbed his face. "We don't know for sure, at least 15, maybe more. Some things are very old, from the 50s or 60s. We'll be sorting through this for weeks, maybe months." He fell silent, staring into the blackness of the woods. "You're lucky. If you hadn't come forward, you might have been next. The things he left, they were part of his ritual. He was preparing." That night, I didn't sleep either. Lying in the sleeping bag on my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Dober was arrested. The danger was over, but I didn't feel relieved, only empty, with a strange, sticky feeling that something was still not right. The next day, I drove back to town, went by the sheriff's office for details. He looked even more exhausted, said that Dober barely spoke, just sat in his cell staring at the wall, refused a lawyer, wouldn't sign any documents. I asked about the things they'd found. The sheriff sighed heavily, opened a file on his desk. "We identified several victims," he said. "Linda Marshall, yes. Little girl, Emma Clark. Tourist from Ohio. We're checking the name. The drifter, probably David Thomas. Several more people who were never officially reported missing. Homeless folks, wanderers, people without families, people nobody was looking for." He showed me a few photos recovered in the house. Old black and whites, edges yellowed by time. In one, a middle-aged man stood beside that sagging house. But in the photo, the house looked new, solid. At the man's feet, items were carefully laid out in rows, bones, scraps of cloth, things I couldn't identify. "We think that's Dober's father," said the sheriff. "The photo is dated 1957. Looks like this is a family thing, a tradition, passed from father to son." A chill spread inside me. This hadn't been going on for 20 years. This was much, much older. The sheriff showed me another find, a diary found in a tin box in the basement. The diary was old, bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was uneven, letters varied in size and slant, as if written by different people, or by one person at different ages and in changing states of mind. The entries spanned decades. The first dated back to 1943. I read several pages and understood. This was a chronicle of murders, meticulously documented. Every victim was recorded. Name, where known, age, description, where they were found, how they were caught, what was done to them. The entries were brief, businesslike, emotionless, no hint of regret or remorse, as if this was just routine, something ordinary. The last entry had been made 2 weeks before I arrived. New tenant in the old McKenna rental house. Young man, alone, no family nearby. Ready to begin preparation. I closed the diary. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it. Dober had chosen me as his next victim before I'd even arrived. The objects he left weren't just macabre gifts or warnings. They were preparation, part of his ritual before the hunt. He was sharing his past victims with the future one, with me. The sheriff took the diary, sealed it in an evidence bag. "You shouldn't stay in that house," he said. Rent a room here in town. There's a motel on the outskirts. Stay there until this is over, until we get to the bottom of all this." I nodded. That same day, I packed all my things and loaded the car. As I left, I looked back at the house one last time. Gray, sagging, with its creaking porch, a place that had nearly become my grave. A month later, Dober still hadn't spoken. He was placed in a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. Experts disagreed. Some called him insane, suffering from a rare disorder. Others insisted he was fully conscious of his actions, using silence as a shield. The count of victims kept climbing as police processed the evidence. 23 confirmed, another 8 pending identification. Some remains were found in the woods, buried in shallow graves within 5 miles of the house. Others had been almost completely destroyed by fire. Just fragments of bone and teeth remained. Police suspected the real number of victims might be twice as high. I returned to my normal life, moved back to the city, finished the novel, found a publisher. The book even achieved a degree of success, but something had changed in me after those weeks in the Appalachians. I became cautious, suspicious. I lock the doors 3 times before bed, check all the window latches, flinch at every unexpected sound. Sometimes at night I wake to the sound of footsteps on the porch. I know it's just a dream, a hallucination, an echo of that time, but still get up, look through the peephole, expecting to see an object left by someone in the dark, a bone, a doll's head, a jar of ashes. Dober is in the hospital. He'll never leave it. But now I know he wasn't the first. His father did the same. Maybe his grandfather too. A whole line of killers stretching into the past, into the darkness of history. How many victims will never be found? How many names remain unknown, written only in that old diary? Sometimes I think about that house in the woods. I wonder, is the owner renting it out again? Is someone living there now? Does a new tenant find things on the porch, hear footsteps at night? I hope not. I hope the house stands empty, abandoned, like Dober's home. 2 dead places in a dead part of the state. But deep down, in the part of me changed forever by all this, I know the truth. Such places are never empty for long. There's always someone looking for silence, solitude, a place to hide from the world. And then maybe the footsteps return, objects start appearing again, the ritual resumes, because some things don't die with people. They persist in places, in houses, in forests, waiting for the next. Thank you for watching.